Recording has begun. The broadcast of the regular meeting of the Charter Commission Government Structure Work Group will now begin.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this virtual meeting of the Charter Commission's Government Structure Work Group. The meeting includes the remote participation of members as authorized under Minnesota State Statute, Section 13D.021, due to the declared local health pandemic. For the record, my name is Jill Garcia, and I am one of the co-chairs of this Charter Commission's Government Structure Work Group. I will now call this meeting to order and ask the clerk to call the roll so we can verify a quorum.
Commissioner Ginder.
Present.
Commissioner Mecki. Commissioner Smith.
Here.
Commissioner Clegg.
Here.
Commissioner Mecki. Co-Chair Abbott.
Present.
Co-Chair Garcia.
Present.
There are 5 members present.
Let the record reflect we have a quorum, and we'll now proceed to our agenda, a copy of which was posted for public access to the city's legislative information management system, which is available at lims.minneapolismn.gov. Commissioners, the agenda for today's meeting is before us. May I have a motion to adopt the agenda?
So moved.
Is there a second? I believe Abbott seconded. Is there any discussion before the clerk calls the roll? Seeing no discussion, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll on the motion.
Commissioner Ginder.
Aye.
Commissioner Mecki. Commissioner Smith.
Aye.
Commissioner Clegg.
Aye.
Commissioner Mecki. Co-Chair Abbott.
Aye.
Co-Chair Garcia.
Aye.
There are 5 ayes.
Great, motion passes and the agenda is adopted. Item 3 on the agenda is to receive and file responses from participating council members about the agreed upon concepts and initial draft amendments from this work group. What we would like to do is, you are all together invited to ask questions. We sent out some questions to kind of get started and get the ball rolling, or if you have your own questions, that would be great. The primary benefit of all being together is if more than one of you have the same question and you would like to hear that and or have a follow-up to that. If there are things that you would just like to share or questions that you would just like to ask and are fine with that, you may do so, and then if you leave the meeting if you so wish. So
Madam Chair, if I may, I know that some of our participants, our witnesses today, have got some time limitations on how long they can be. I don't know if we want to start with the folks that have a limitation on their time and get their input right away. Would that work?
Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm happy to follow that suggestion. I did just want to take a chance to thank you on behalf of the City Council for inviting us here and for sending us the materials with time to look through the proposal. The summary was very clear and helpful, and I think the questions you've posed, will help us frame this discussion today. I also got a chance to meet with Ms. Garcia as well as Charter Commission Chair Clegg last week, and we had a really great and robust discussion. I'm happy to defer to colleagues again who may need to leave. I did just want to highlight one theme that I think we talked about a lot in this discussion with Chair Clegg and the chair of this work group, Garcia, which is about the city's policy-making function. And, I've been in office for 7 years. We have council members who've been in office over 20 years, and a council member who joined us just, months ago in the midst of so many crises. You'll have a wide range of perspectives based on, all kinds of factors, which ward folks represent, how long they've been on the council, et cetera. While I've been in office even a relatively short time, what we hear from our constituents as far as expectations for the city and for the city council have changed. And I think as we see things happening at the federal government, where there's a lot of gridlock at state legislatures here in Minnesota and across the country, more and more people are really looking to local governments, to their cities, their townships, their community, to really be that front line for things like raising the minimum wage or requiring paid sick time, to really dig into housing stability, race equity, climate change, and to really take a policy-making approach to this job. And that pressure and those asks are coming from community, from our constituents. Again, probably very different across the city and the different wards, depending on the circumstances that people are facing and how much housing insecurity they have, how much economic insecurity they have, the racial and economic makeup of the wards, all very different. So I just want to offer an observation, which is that kind of no matter which form of government the city has, I have seen a real need and a shift over time in some departments to create more capacity for supporting policymaking as a function. Writing ordinances, doing community engagement around policy change, and asking these questions about how our policies or lack thereof are equity and climate and some of these big questions. I think so that is around the city shifting and changing to adapt to these requests from our constituents to do a lot more in the frame of policymaking. And I think we've been very successful. I've been in some department head reviews recently. We've made huge progress on creating land use policy through the 2040 plan, transportation, climate action policy, zero waste policy frameworks. And these might sound like just plans that are sitting around, and that would, that's okay. But council members know that those plans are actually guiding the work of city departments. They're leading to policy change and budget investments. And over the last 10 years, there's been a huge amount of work done to create citywide policy frameworks. So we're not doing as much one by one, project by project, ward by ward decision making. We have a framework for land use and housing. We have a framework for stormwater management or water quality management or climate change or our waste policies. And so, I think continuing to evolve and invest in that capacity is critical to being able to meet the expectations of our constituents. And with that, I'll just thank you again, and I think it's very reasonable to invite folks who may need to leave to go first.
Thank you very much, Council President Bender. If anyone has any time commitments, please raise your hand, chime in. If anybody, okay, not hearing anybody or seeing anyone. Is there anyone that has particular interest to start us off? Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Chair Garcia, and I really appreciate the invite here, and spent quite a bit of time reading the information that was attached to this legislative file, and so I really appreciate all of that as well. There's a lot of great history in there, and it's really great reading to go through. And so I just had kind of a few questions that I was wondering that others might have as well. Just if you could help me, maybe I missed this in the documents, but any kind of historical framing up of this issue being teed up today. So is this something that's been in the works for a while after the simplification of the language in the charter, and this is a regular review of the structure of the city government, looking for opportunities to be more efficient. Is this a reaction to something? Essentially, is it trying to solve a specific problem, or is it taking a step back and saying, you know, let's really look, it's time for a check on our structure and seeing if there's something that might work better than what we have today. So that was really my first question, and probably just a couple, maybe I'll just throw them out real quick as well, a couple of clarifying questions too. When I read about the executive function, is that intended to prevent council from issuing staff directions, which I know is something through our legislative action that we do today? And then also just in general, kind of around the enforceability, I know this is something I mentioned in an email to Commissioner Clegg, but who would be tasked with any attempts to interfere one way or the other if the council members try to cross into executive? If this was to pass, let's say the language as it is today, if the council members were to attempt to direct staff or purport to direct staff, which the language says today, or the mayor failed to deliver information that the council requested, then is this something that the expectation would be the remedy is through the court system, or is there an expectation that there's a separate body or structure? Because I didn't see that listed in there, and so I was just curious on thoughts on how that would work as we're thinking about how something like this would play out.
Thank you, Councilmember Johnson. To your first question about the impetus of what got this rolling, it has definitely been something on the radar that the charter has been pretty outdated, and over the years there have been efforts to change it and to tweak it and to bring it up to kind of up to current standards. And as everybody has heard, if we were to create a charter for the city of Minneapolis now, this is definitely not what we would do. Nevertheless, I think one thing that Council President Bender hit on the head is that times change over the years. And as things have changed, the question about modernizing the charter remains. How that's done is something that we're able to take a look at now. And I think really looking at the policymaking function of the council is one of those big goals as far as just clarifying the charter. One thing that I understand when we did the plain language version of the charter was to really minimize substantive changes and just put it into clear language. So staying true to that, you know, even though it was very tempting to change, we kind of stuck with the bare bones charter as it was. And now I think as times have changed, as the city has modernized and grown into the policymaking function and into responding to more of the where the rubber meets the road needs, that local government. I mean, that's the purpose of having home rule charter, is to be able to customize for the needs of the city and the people of the city. And so there really wasn't any other impetus for doing that. It has nothing to do with really anything going on. It's just a chance to make the lines between the executive functions and the legislative functions a little bit more distinct and clear, to make sure that the council can really optimize its strengths and move forward equipped as it ought to be for policymaking, and constituent relations, as it depends on your priorities and your ward priorities, and the overall priorities of the city. And really kind of be clear on the executive function of the mayor and ensuring that the administration and the operations of the city can move forward, and can leave you all with the opportunities to do the policymaking and constituent relations. I know different wards have different needs, and that can be, up to each council member to determine. As far as staff direction, I'm going to kind of put your question about staff direction and enforceability together. What we've been calling the prime directive, that is purely something that we saw in Duluth's charter. It's not anything that we all came up with. We saw it in Duluth's charter. We haven't really seen it notably in any other charter. We've looked at several comparable cities, and maybe there's been like one or two. I know Peter Ginder has his hand up, and he did some pretty extensive review of those, and I'll circle back to Commissioner Ginder. But as we left that prime directive in as a means of conversation, not as, how this is something we need, or this is something that's been asked for, but it's simply for conversation. It's not anticipated. We also sent you the memo, the list of 5 or 6 items. We don't anticipate that all of them will make it into the proposed charter, and there may be things out there that we haven't looked at that will wind up making it into the proposed charter, depending on what comes up during the public hearing, and just what comes up in February when we kind of take a look at the language. So I hope that helps. Commissioner Ginder?
Thank you, Chair. Councilmember Johnson, when that was put in there, the chair is correct. That was a discussion starting point. I would note, just for your information, that several major cities that we use as comparators have similar language. You'll find it in places like Seattle, Oakland, offhand, I think Detroit, but several cities have it. Conversely, St. Paul has nothing like it at all. It simply says that there's a strong mayor system and gives the policymaking to the legislative authority to the council. And there's nothing in there like that says this is how you have to split it out. So it's really just a discussion starting point. I don't think, at least from my perspective, see a need to have a misdemeanor violation hanging out there that somebody would try to go to court to enforce. As a practical matter, for example, in cities like St. Paul, how strictly that bar on staff direction is enforced depends on how the mayor approaches the job. And so there may be a time when some mayors say, if you want to call, supervisors in public works directly and talk about issues, fine. Others may say, no, run it through me or the department head or whomever my designees are for that. And so that's something that we're exploring. And it's probably, in one sense, a continuation of the line what happened when the city put in 311. It removed council members from a lot of the daily calls from constituents about, what do I do about a stop sign? Where does this go? And so that's one way to look at it. But again, it's really a starting point for discussion for the larger charter commission.
And I don't want to, we don't have to talk about each and every change. Does anybody else have any more questions?
Well, co-chair, I wanted to, this is Commissioner Abbott, I wanted to address a couple of questions that were raised by Councilmember Johnson. At least for me, I mean, I think that kind of this ambiguous assignment of powers in the current charter has really been kind of a source of controversy in Minneapolis for years, and it's been something that I've been personally wanting to do something about for a long time. I mean, going back into I'd say the 2005-2006 timeframe, and I got onto the Charter Commission in October of 2018, right at the end of the process when Councilmember Gordon had his proposed public safety amendment. And I was very intrigued by that amendment because the 2018 amendment proposed that we divide the executive and legislative authority with respect to the police between the mayor and the council, and that the mayor would be in charge of administration and the council would be in charge of policymaking for police matters. And I thought that was an excellent idea. The problem I had with that proposal at the time was it kind of was the thread that would unravel the whole charter unless you did it throughout the whole charter. I mean, it would create kind of as drafted, I thought it would create kind of this, odd kind of ambiguity in the charter about what the rest of the charter looked like. And it was unclear how it would work. And to me, that raised the larger question of, I think that there's, the question of, is there an opportunity to basically do the separation of powers matter, in a larger sense? And then, of course, last year's public safety amendment and the debate therein. I mean, this work group was created because the public safety work group last year, realized that some elements of that proposal really kind of raised kind of larger government structure questions, and that's specifically how this got raised. It's a long-standing issue. I mean, it's a decades-long problem with the Minneapolis City Charter. This is not the charter we have was not designed by someone to operate in this way. It is the charter represents decades of ad hoc political compromises, and it's really kind of a miracle that it works as well as it does. And I think given the public safety debate that happened last year, and I think there is some public interest in kind of looking at Minneapolis government this year. I think it's kind of an opportunity now to take a decades-old problem and give the voters a chance to address it. On the question of the executive function, would it prevent the council from issuing a staff direction? I mean, I think the answer to that question is really more in the nature of what the direction is, right? I mean, if it's a policy-making function, it would stay with the council. If it's an executive or administrative direction, it would be over on the mayor's side. So it would really depend on the subject matter of what the council action would be. And I mean, we could write pages trying to define what a staff direction is or isn't. And I don't think that's an appropriate element for the charter. I think that's just going to have something that have to be worked out between the mayor and the council. And the question,
Co-Chair Abbott.
Yeah.
I think we should probably move on. Councilmember Goodman, did you have anything that you wanted to ask or pose to us before you had to get off?
No, I'm good. I'm working on something else while this is going on. When you call on me to speak, I'm happy to do so.
Oh, which is what I'm doing.
Oh, okay. I'll just say, first of all, thank you for inviting us to speak. Change is hard, and the only guarantee in life is that there's going to be change, and I don't think that we should fear it, but we should embrace it. This charter was put together like in the 1920s, and a lot has changed since the charter was put into place, and it makes sense from my point of view to review it and renew it and make changes based on what's happening. The technology has changed. The way people interact with government has changed. There are so many things that are different even from when I first started on the city council. In fact, when I first started on the city council, I didn't know how to use a computer. And we still had pink slips for phone calls. So, and that was in, 1998. That wasn't that long ago. So things change, and I think it's fair for the charter to change. What I will say about our current system of government is, if it was so great, other governments would be doing it. The Humphrey Institute would be teaching classes on why it was so good and why other city councils from around the country should pick this weird form of government. But we're the only ones who have this form of government. And I would argue it does not work. And I guess the only comment I would make is I would go much further than what the Charter Commission has currently proposed. I would look at the independent boards and commissions to determine whether or not we need to have independent boards and commissions. I would look at the Board of Estimate and Taxation and determine if that is a relic or something that's really needed and what the makeup of it should be. I maybe would look at whether or not there should be a city manager. Maybe there shouldn't be. I don't know the answer to that. But what I do know is that the system we have right now is not perfect, because there is no perfect system. And if there are a group of volunteers appointed by us or the courts to take a look at it and attempt to try to improve it, more power to you. We have a lot of things going on in the city, but defending a system that no one else uses and holding it up as if it's the best thing in the world and we're afraid of it change because we might lose some level of power is not about public service. And so I would encourage you to go further than you already have. I think that the public deserves a form of government where they can reach people and they can get their questions answered. And I agree with Council President Bender, actually, that the council focusing on policy is a good thing. But a group of staff having 14 bosses and many of whom don't get along, and I'm not talking about this council, every council that I've worked with, every group of 50 people that I've worked with, there's been conflict between people, not always the same people, not always the same conflict, not always the same conflict with staff or the mayor. But what we do know is that 14 people telling any one department head what to do is not fair to staff. And I mean, if nothing says it, we've lost like 12 high-level staff people in the last year, including now potentially a police chief, which is alarming to me. And so I think it's fair to look at it. I don't have a strong opinion about what you determine to do, but I also think it's fair for the public, as long as they understand, to decide what they think this form of government should be. And I would urge you to look at government systems that work and those that are more common in cities of our size. So I'm just making my own speech. I'm happy whoever wants to hear it, and I'm glad I'm not on the Charter Commission. But what I can say is, should I be reelected, I can roll with it. I can figure out how to work within the system and with people. And I think most of my colleagues on this call are people. They're good at working with people, and they too will adjust. And new people who come onto the council will have known no different. And we should be in a situation where our staff feel supported and empowered, and they know who their boss is. And we as council members know what our role is in creating policy. I'm particularly attracted to the idea that we would have more of a policy making line, and that we would be more in the more what Council President Bender said, that as the city changes and people are looking to local government to do more, that we spend more of our time doing that instead of telling staff what to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Bender. I will then.
I'm good. Just to be clear.
Oh, I'm sorry, Councilmember Goodman. Yes, I just have the two Lisas. You're in my. Both Lisas are in my same column. I'd like to jump into the questions that everybody was given. So start thinking about those questions. I saw Councilmember Cunningham's hand up. I was first going to call on Commission Chair Clegg.
Councilmember Schrader has been waiting for a minute, just so you know. So
sorry.
Just want to make sure, yeah.
I hadn't seen him. I'll put that.
Thank you, Co-Chair Garcia. What I really appreciate all the council members being here. What I'm a little leery of is that if it's you asking us questions about why this is in there, or what that means, that all the time will be taken by charter commissioners talking. And your time is valuable, and we know that. What we'd like to hear is your views on the questions we answered. We'd like to hear what you like about the proposal and what you don't like. And we'd like to hear what questions you have. What I'd suggest, though, is we not take time today in this forum to have charter commissioners respond, just because I think that will take more time than we have. And I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Clegg. Councilmember Schrader?
Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to also extend my, thanks so much for, asking the council to be here, and really appreciate, the chance to speak. I would say I have severe concerns with the proposal you put forward, mainly around accountability. As with the council and cities are being asked to do more, like, we represent very different parts of the city, and moving toward a much more strong mayor system that you're proposing would create, I think, a lot of problems. I mean, it would make sure that the folks that are doing that churn out to elections and historically have churned out to elections have a much louder voice, as we see in mayoral elections versus individual ward elections. What really does work about the system right now is that you have individual council members that are able to represent their small area. And regardless of if everyone who has a bigger voter turnout, we're able to get into the very specific issues of home ownership, of renting, of fairness, of really dealing with the inequities that this city has. And I worry that would be lost under this system that you're proposing. I think that there would be an opportunity to give voice, but that's really no different than what the public has on its own. What's strong about this system is that you have a position of power that looks toward, that has the ability to make a difference in people's lives, and to make sure that they're following through and making sure that the city works for everybody. So that would be probably my largest concern. It is something that my background, as I was the executive director of Common Cause Minnesota, which is a statewide nonpartisan good government group. And it really is about making sure that people had their voice heard, and that they were able to make sure that the systems of power work for them. And so I think, to Councilmember Goodman's point about what works for, we don't see this everywhere. I think it's really about looking at the outcomes, about areas where we've been able to make an impact on the disparities that we have in our city. And what this council and other previous councils have been able to do with this system, and really ask the question of what would be lost at going to another system. I did have a question on which models the commission looked at. I think I really appreciate some of the background from Commissioner Ginter and Commissioner Abbott, but I was struck by if what parts of those other models, brought this draft that we see before us. I mean, I guess one of the things that really brought that question about, we do have one department right now that operates in this way, and is the police department, that operates very much through the mayor without influence from the council. And frankly, that's also the department that's getting sued by the state as well as others. And it is something that, in this year we've had a lot of discussion about how that department interacts with the city. So it's something that I really appreciate that this is a longer question, but in this context of 2020 and 2021, I do have some questions about how this model is the one that makes the most sense.
Thank you, Councilmember Schrader. Again, just to respect everyone's time, I would say that if you look on LIMS for our work group, we have all of the comparative research and items on in our LIMS file. And with respect to the police department, there wasn't, I don't recall a whole lot of variation, but I know that the investigation being done by the state will have a lot to say. So I think I'll leave that to the state to put forth what they recommend. Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, everyone, for having us. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to be here. And let me pull up my notes here right quick. Okay, so just going through the questions, I think that one of the issues that we just generally struggle with is that the public doesn't understand what the mayor's responsibilities are. I think that one of the things that I go back and forth with a little bit is I feel like, generally speaking, that when it comes to if you have an executive and a legislative branch, that it's pretty consistent, the division of power and authority and work between those two branches. So the idea that you know, city staff have 14 bosses, like, that's just inconsistent with a generally understood separation of powers. So I think that that there's a misunderstanding, because I'll just say that my constituents expect me to do everything, and they don't understand like what the mayor's job is. I too have some pretty serious concerns about the misdemeanor aspect of the proposal. The reason why it was a major red flag for me is because anything that involves the criminal justice system inherently disproportionately negatively impacts people of color. So this makes me very nervous as a Black city council member around how do I know that like my actions won't be skewed by people's bias that I'm crossing a line. Like, I just don't trust. I don't trust that. Like, that makes me very nervous. And given the fact that government systems and leadership in government systems have not been particularly friendly to people of color to begin with, this makes me very, very nervous. I also had, a question around the staff directions. I think that there's two parts to it. A lot of work is initiated. I would say a good portion of the work that is initiated from council is from that it originates from staff directions. But I also think that if we had our own legislative division, if we were adequately staffed, that we wouldn't have to ask department staff to do so much of the policy work that is initiated through staff directions. So there's like the two sides of that. And I'll just say, you know, I have big apprehension. I think this is kind of a little bit building on what Councilmember Schrader brought up, but I do have some apprehension around the concept of a strong mayor, because the mayor is the only at-large elected official at this municipal governing level. And we know how at-large seats generally work. North Minneapolis has a low turnout rate in comparison to the rest of the city. So if we have a stronger mayor that has more authority, I guess, again, I feel like it's pretty clear, like executive versus legislative. But if we are, you know, codifying it in a way where it's like, if we are giving direction to staff, it's a misdemeanor. I mean, that's a pretty strong direction. That makes me concerned because, generally speaking, I mean, we're talking about politicians. People are going to go where the votes are. They're going to follow the voices that are the loudest. They're going to listen to the voices that emerge from the parts of the city that have the highest voter turnout. And I don't even know when the last time the North Side had a mayor. Like, a mayor came from the North Side. And so, like, having that sort of concentration of power will, in my opinion, cause undue harm. Like, the part that I feel like my job as a Northside council member is to be an advocate in many, many ways. And I just have some concerns around what that means. Because I feel like a part of my job is in the policymaking process in high level city operations to make sure that North Minneapolis is getting equitable city resources as well as city services. So that's just a concern. So what appears to be missing that should be accounted for in any potential amendment? I think that there needs to be, what needs to be addressed is the inconsistency between the requirement of funding for staff in the mayor's office and the city council. There's an inconsistency there. The way the charter currently reads is that the city council must fund the mayor with adequate staff or something along those lines. But it leaves out the reality that the mayor writes the budget proposal. And so that puts us in a position that if we need additional staff to be adequately staffed, we have to cut the proposed department funding in order to have adequate staffing. So I think that inconsistency is an issue, particularly given the fact we are moving to being such a policy heavy, legislative focused council. So then I have two questions and then I'll stop talking for at least for now. The question that I would have, is, no, I'm sorry, I have a question and a comment. I would just say that, our system, of course, is not perfect. And it's not being emulated, but maybe it should. Minneapolis does have the highest voter turnout rate in the country. So that is demonstrating that our diffuse system of government is actually producing a more civically engaged population. So I'll just throw that out there. Of course, that's not empirically tested as like a correlation, but I just wanted to throw that out there. I think that that's something that's really noteworthy. Because I've lived in other cities that have very strong mayor systems and voter turnout is nowhere near as high as here. So I just want to throw that out there. And then I know that you all have research, but at some point I would like to be able to maybe hear the logic as to why this particular structure versus like switching over to a manager city council structure. So because there are other, obviously you all know that because you've done your research, but that would be my question is why the logic for this particular structure, but you don't have to answer that now so that I have more room for colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Cunningham. And as we said, we're here to listen to you. If at the end of this, there's anything left, any questions left for you, we're happy to follow up with you individually if a couple of you have the same questions. So thank you very much. If I may call on Councilmember Fletcher and then Council President Bender after that.
Thank you very much, Chair Garcia and commissioners. So I appreciate that you're looking at this. I think that, in my reading of the charter, I wouldn't have thought there was a need for clarification. Because I read an executive and a legislative, set of functions, but I think we can see plenty of evidence that there's confusion. I think we can see plenty of evidence among folks in city government where there are things that seem clearly like an executive function that aren't necessarily happening out in the mayor's office, or things that feel legislative that seem muddy about how decisions are being made. Certainly confusion from constituents, as Councilmember Cunningham noted, about who to hold accountable for what decisions and who they should be talking to about what issues. So if we can provide clarity, I think that's valuable. I don't necessarily think that we have a weak mayor in our current charter. I don't know that we need a stronger mayor, but I think that having clarity about executive and legislative functions might be very helpful, and I could see some value in that. That being said, I think that it feels to me in reading this like an overfocus on how to hold the council accountable for not impinging on executive function, and maybe not enough attention to how to create accountability for the executive function, to create that executive function in a way that's clearly defined and that can create some accountability. So I think it's worth looking at that. I also think it's really important to define in thinking about that prime directive, and I was glad to hear Commissioner Ginder say that he doesn't see that misdemeanor as being a particularly valuable thing. I think that would have a chilling effect on communication generally. But I think some better definition of what constitutes an order, so that we have guidance. And I think, like Councilmember Goodman said, I think we could adjust to a variety of arrangements on this, but I think we need to be clear when we're doing constituent services. If my constituents are really, frustrated about something, and I go and talk to that department head or to the staff who are responsible for it and say, we got to come up with a solution, do they walk away interpreting that as an order? I think sometimes our voices ring out louder than we even mean them to, and I don't want to feel, again, that chilling effect of am I crossing a line here that I'm unclear about? There's certainly models for constituent service in the US Congress and at the state legislature where legislators, policymakers help constituents navigate processes and aren't giving orders. And I think there's ways to manage that and to set constituents' expectations so that they see those things. But I would want to have more clarity about that, because I don't want to be in a situation where our constituents are constantly asking us to cross a line that we vote into the charter. I do have a question. It feels like the phrase consents to in the appointment process might water down legislative power. It feels fairly consistent with other levels of government to describe the mayor appointing or the mayor nominating and the council confirming, or some sort of I'd like more clarity about what the council role is in staff appointments. That feels unclear to me in my reading of the current draft. And I do think that in thinking about, I've been thinking about that staff issue, and it's probably not an issue to resolve in charter, but I do think the guidance around that separation will be important to sort of figure out. I think it is clear that as we move to a legislative structure, whether or not we move forward with a charter amendment coming out of this discussion, I think this discussion has prompted some important conversations just sort of about how business is happening at the city. And I think there's an opportunity to think about the staff resources that support the legislative process. And, right now I'll just note that the mayor's office has policy staff who are dedicated to policy. And so in the executive branch, we have policy staff, and in the legislative branch, we don't have dedicated policy staff. So that's probably something that we want to look at, that we want to think about how are we organizing that work. And that might be something that coincides well with this kind of a charter process. So I'll name that. I think that's worth looking at. I think that there are ways that we can align the city operations and the city expectations, kind of regardless of whether a charter amendment happens. But I can see some value in creating some clarity. So thanks for taking this up, and I'll be interested to hear what we come up with as we dig more into it.
Thank you, Councilmember Fletcher. Council President Bender.
Thank you. A lot of my points have been made by my colleagues. I do think the misdemeanor piece, I'll just emphasize, I think stands out, but maybe in a broader context of our constituents' expectations are that they contact their city council member about any number of day-to-day things that are affecting their life or their business. And so whatever happens, there would need to be a transition plan or some way of understanding what happens. So what happens when my constituent emails me and says, I want a speed bump? Or what happens when my constituent emails me and says, there's a homeless encampment outside my house, I'm worried about what's happening? Or what happens when our constituent, et cetera. And I think some of the offices get a ton more calls than others. So it'd be worth, I think hearing from council members about what kinds of calls come in and who's responding to them. Often we are just passing them along. I get tons of, it's snow season, so I've got constituents saying all kinds of things about what's happening with plowing. I pass those along to Public Works. I let my constituents know that those decisions are made administratively by Public Works. But so we see that tension. I guess the overall point there is we see that tension now as council members about sort of our role as facilitating an outcome that our constituent wants on those day-to-day constituent service needs. I wanted to emphasize the staffing issue of the council. The council has no communication staff. It has no policy staff that report directly to us. So when the city council writes an ordinance, for example, it's partly a cultural thing. So at the legislature, laws originate in all different kinds of ways, and it's not unusual for a legislator to bring in a law forward that they've authored and propose it for their colleagues to vote on. At the city staff who work for departments write ordinances. They do the policy research. They do any communications that may or may not happen. They do community engagement that may or may not happen. And they're doing that, in addition to other things, in addition to, program management or grant management. And so, again, I'll repeat that when I think the city has transitioned a bit. But a lot of staff at the city are still doing that sort of grant management, contract management, program management, or kind of nuts and bolts, like running the water system, running the street system, and we've added more sort of policy staff to support that function, but they don't report. I mean, they report through the council. You know, the department heads are appointed by the mayor, nominated by the mayor, approved by the council. But culturally, it would just, I think we were starting to push the edges of this a little bit, but the idea that a council member would bring an ordinance for a vote or, you know, for public comment and vote that wasn't written by city staff just really doesn't happen. So I think, you know, some of the ideas that Casey has been talking about with you and with the council, and we've all been talking about together is, you know, how could we think about staffing the council so that there is research staff that reports directly to the council that isn't doing all these other program management type things, whose job would be to research minimum wage policies around the country, figure out if we need to contract with Cura to do an analysis of a rent increase cap ordinance, etc. But there will still be a need to decide, like, what's the line there between where do subject matter expert staff in city departments weigh in and how in that legislative process. And then I also observed this question around accountability for the executive branch, especially given our city's worst in the country racial disparities. I think it's worth considering explicitly mentioning equity in some of the language. There's other kind of outcomes listed in our charter. I think we should consider adding equity as one. Small thing, but a suggestion. And I do want to note and reflect that I do see my colleagues of color being treated differently by folks within the enterprise, being treated differently in the community. They are facing racism in their jobs. And in this last year, many of us, you know, maybe all of us are also facing personal threats to our safety and that of our family. And so under extraordinary circumstances, council members have stepped up into gaps in our system where there wasn't staff, you know, sometimes out in the streets trying to help put out fires, responding to trauma in the community, using their own cultural competence, their language skills, their community skills to fill gaps that don't exist in the system. So I think sometimes when people see council stepping up, they think, oh, this is like a power grab or they're trying to like take over. But I think council members under extraordinary personal circumstances, including threats to their safety and that of their family, are stepping into gaps that our community needs to have filled. And so, you know, I also really appreciate the chance to step back and say, how can we all do better as a system to deliver on not just kind of generally how do we do better as a city, but how do we really, really focus in on these commitments around race equity that we know we need, and how do we reflect the reality that leaders of color face a different set of expectations, you know, in every aspect of these jobs.
Thank you, Council President. Chair Clegg asked to kind of squeak in here, Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you. We've been talking a lot about policy, and I'm just interested in everybody's suggestions specifically as to how we could beef up that function in the charter. As you know, the charter is pretty broad brush when it comes to talking about the mayor's staff. It doesn't say the mayor has exactly this many staff and this is what their titles are. It does for a couple of positions, but that's about it. So we're very interested in beefing up the policymaking function, and given how the charter works in terms of being very broad brush, I'm just wondering how what your suggestions are for doing that. Thank you.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And, you know, I'm really approaching this change in this language with an open mind. Generally, I think it's a good idea to step back from things and take a look at best practices as part of our system and how we can find opportunities to improve things. So, and generally, I think that more clarity would be a good thing as well. So I could see these changes potentially being positive. I could also see there being potentially some negatives associated with it. And so, as a systems engineer, I think I'll just raise a few thoughts here, and these really aren't intended to be any sort of judgment on where this is, so much as it is maybe food for thought for commissioners as you're considering and weighing this. One thought was to what Commissioner Abbott said about the police department and the 2018 change and how that would have been kind of its own standout thing. I could really see a lot of value in having MPD as part of this change and part of your draft, having legislative authority around police be part of council authority just for consistency, and having it really be applied globally with that separation of power. When I look at nominations for department heads and think about a 4-year term and how this is structured, what I'm about to say, I think depending on how you look at it, could be viewed as either a positive thing or a negative thing. I actually had a conversation with a department head who was really struck by the fact that in Minneapolis, we seem very reluctant to remove department heads and very reluctant to call them before the council and ask tough questions or kind of grill them, if you will. I could see how if you had an extended term for department heads, and if you did not have that executive function where they're reporting more so to that committee from an executive side, how you could see the consequence of that being council members may be more willing to call department heads before committees, ask tough questions, that sort of thing, that is currently today happening very informally. That's very relational, behind the scenes meetings, questions, trying to work together very collaboratively, which sometimes when we do that with the best of intents, at least it's been my experience working with the department head through meetings, sometimes the result is positive and sometimes things don't get done. And so I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing for it to be more public, but I think it's something to be aware of and to think through how that could work out. One of the things I noted in your research was around mayors and whether or not they have executive experience. And so I think there's some opportunity to really think around that administrative officer type role. I think a city manager has, it sounds like it's good for mid-sized cities, perhaps from the best practices, but I think there could be some potential unintended consequences for a city of our size personally around that. But certainly I think there may be or there might be a more happy medium between like an administrative officer role and the mayor with the executive experience that they may or may not have. And then also just an observation, and this is not directed at any specific mayor, but I just got to say, mayors are extremely busy. So are council members. They're just working nonstop, and inevitably they are going to delegate many things to their staff. And we'll find that a lot of the decisions that are coming from the mayor's office are actually happening not from the mayor, but from staff. So as you're thinking about accountability and transparency for the public, I think that is one thing that could potentially shift, is that if you're seeing what might be a kind of collaborative decision between committee or a committee chair and the mayor's office, you may see that if the executive function is under purely the mayor's office, that may end up becoming really more of a staff-driven decision within the mayor's office that the mayor may or may not weigh in on, depending on that mayor, right? But I think you could potentially see less of the transparency, kind of less of that direct accountability for that. That said, then there's that trade-off, right, is that person is working for the mayor, so there's that delegation and that kind of team creation and culture that mayor is creating, and depending on how they do with that, it could be really positive, or it could have downsides as well. And then when I think about that executive function, the trade-off I think of is with something like Intergovernmental Relations, which I am the chair of that committee. And as things are happening very quickly at the legislature, there's a lot of working closely with staff on, what's our next step in terms of lobbying? What are we going to do supporting this new bill that came out? That sort of thing that really happens much more rapidly than the council process or cycle. And again, that would be one of those things just to think through about for some of those cases where there is kind of that more specific quick need. Is that something that the mayor would then be really involved in? Would it ultimately most likely fall to one of the mayor's staff, or might there be some opportunity to kind of preserve that dynamic between council and the departments that they're working closely with? I'd echo what some of my colleagues said around constituent service. I think that is such a critical and important job of council members, and certainly appreciate Commissioner Ginder's comments around not wanting to create a chilling effect on that. I think, it's important for us to be able to go to departments and say, hey, this alley didn't get plowed, or hey, here's a complex problem property case, and we need to bring together a bunch of different departments because there's huge problems that are being created on this block because of one household on the block that is causing a lot of destruction, a lot of damage. How can we come up with a comprehensive game plan to really address this problem? And I think being able to preserve that sort of constituent service is really important. I know to Commissioner Clegg, one concern I raised in email was really around the language. I think it was in, let me just quick pull up the section. It was in H1B, and that was specifically about council members advocating, for instance, for removal of any employee. I think certainly it would be inappropriate for a council member to do that with anyone in the civil service. I'm pretty sure that's already covered under our ethics code and something council members would face consequences for. But my only thought on that is potential chilling effect around department head nominations. So if there's a department head that a council member does not have, for instance, confidence in, their ability to communicate that, or even maybe more subtly communicate how they feel the department is doing, I wouldn't want there to be a chilling effect over that ability to be transparent with how we view the performance of a department as a council member and how we're thinking about that sort of thing without formally starting the actual process for removal, which depending on how you read and interpret the language, it could be perceived that way. And then I just think the one other thing I wanted to mention when talking this through was an answer to one of the questions I asked earlier was that sometimes the style really depends on the mayor, and that some mayors want everything run through them, others not. And I would be very concerned about that if there was that kind of a proposition, because then the mayor's office would become a bottleneck for constituent service, for working with staff on issues, and potentially that could become very problematic if, for instance, a mayor was to cut off access to a council member because they politically opposed them on something and then say, you know what, we're not helping you with these issues, that sort of thing. And that could really impede the ability for a council member to, for instance, get the work done. So, I would certainly hope that would never happen. But I do think removing that discretion is important, or at least preserving that ability today that we have where we can work with departments and request information, have meetings, have conversations, ask for help with constituent service, those sort of things. So I, again, really appreciate being invited here and having the opportunity to share these thoughts, and appreciate the consideration of these thoughts as well.
Thank you, Councilmember Johnson. I was just Council President Bender.
Thank you. I'll be quick. But I did just have a quick thought related to Commissioner Ginder's question. I do think how do you define policy is an important and worthwhile question. And I think, a very obvious example is an ordinance that the council would write or pass. This also generally adopts criteria for a lot of different programmatic functions of the city right now. So for example, the One Minneapolis Fund that NCR gives grants to community groups, the council helps set policy criteria. We set criteria related to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund and how that gets spent. And I think maintaining that function of the council is a good way to address some of the race equity concerns that we've heard. We also have passed policies in recent years that speak to how a department functions, what its priorities and goals should be. And I actually think almost more than anything else I've worked on in my time in office that those have helped bring alignment and really helped the city point in a particular direction. Some examples are the Complete Streets policy that Councilmember Reich worked on a lot as chair of the Transportation and Public Works Committee, that really set forth a policy prioritization framework for the way that the city designs streets. We use that as a model for our Renter First policy, which directs the Regulatory Services Department to prioritize the health and safety and well-being of renters in rental housing, which has had led to a lot of different implementation factors, including us using city resources to go after problem landlords through the city attorney's office and other specific implementation measures. So I think maintaining those kinds of functions as part of the definition of the policy making functions of the city council would help us maintain more of that kind of broad citywide input into those kinds of decisions and operations that our departments carry out.
Thank you, Council President Bender. Yes, I too wanted to come back to what Chair Clegg mentioned about your ideas about beefing up the policymaking and legislative piece. And Council President Bender's putting forth adopting criteria for a policymaking framework is fascinating. Are there any, I'd be eager to hear get any input about what kind of policymaking and legislative functions that for the council around, even around MPD, as Councilmember Johnson had mentioned. Is there clarity around policymaking ways to augment that in the charter? Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you. So I do think, there's an interesting tension, and this probably gets to a lot of times where staff directions happen, right? Is that obviously we have a set of rules in the charter, and then we have a more robust set of rules in ordinance that's clearly policymakers, that's clearly legislative. And then we have departmental policies, and there's definitely, I think, an assumption that there's a clarity about what belongs in departmental policy and what belongs in ordinance. There's actually probably some conversation that ought to happen about that, because I think everybody would agree that we don't want council, picking the brand of paint that we use to paint the lanes on the road. We want to give a framework for saying we paint lanes in the road, and we've got a general theory for how we design, and then leave it to staff and to the executive function to actually execute that policy, right? In policing, it's especially challenging because a lot of very important policies, sometimes as a result of state law requiring that the police department maintain a policy as a departmental policy, exist at the policy level that people really expect that we have a voice in. And that's been part of the charter amendment conversation around policing policy, has been the notion that things like use of force, which feel like very important policy areas, are in that departmental policy. And so there is I think a need for some clarity there. And I do think it's kind of interesting and exciting to hear the way people are thinking about the public safety charter in relationship to this. I had initially sort of thought that these might be oppositional when I first saw this coming along, but the more I listen and the more I'm sort of thinking this through, I do think that there's been a sort of cognitive disconnect where hearing people say, you can't have the police department function the way all the other departments function. How could a department function that way? Makes me think, well, gosh, we should probably clean this up for the other departments, right? We should figure out how to make the governance structure consistent and make sense everywhere. Because if it doesn't make sense for MPD, it probably doesn't make sense for Public Works either. And so having, getting to a place where we have that clarity, that many of us have been talking about here's what the executive does, here's what legislative does, and then it's totally, then every department can be on the same footing, makes a lot of sense to me. And I think obviously you've probably heard that we're bringing forward a version of the Public Safety Charter Amendment, and I think that this might be very compatible with that in terms of creating that clarity. So I find that interesting. The one other thing I wanted to raise that I forgot, if I may, is there's a reference to sort of preventing us from requesting non-public data, and I want to think through that a little bit, because there are definitely cases, and certainly we get legal advice and closed sessions where we learn information about lawsuits, where we have to make budgetary decisions about settlements. There are functions of council right now where we certainly have to receive non-public data. I think as officers of the city, it's appropriate sometimes for us to receive non-public data, for us to hear, for example, personnel information that wouldn't be categorized as public, where we're making decisions and trying to understand what's happening in a department. So I guess I had a little bit of concern about that, and I can't think of that many examples where we request that data, other than sometimes I think wanting to know about crime incidents that happen where the information might not be public, but it's sort of relevant to us being able to advise our constituents or think about policy. So that was one other area where I wondered if that was the right approach.
Thank you, Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you.
President Bender.
Thanks. I forgot to mention this question of timing of implementation.
Yes.
And I think I saw that the proposal would implement this change midway through the next mayoral term, and kind of in that awkward time frame where there'll be two-year council terms. I wanted to reflect that seems a bit challenging to me, because voters would be voting in November whether or not to make this change. They'd be voting for a mayor, kind of with the assumptions about how our system works now, and then halfway through that term, the mayor would take on a different role with a new council. So I guess I hear the kind of desire to make this change and implement a change more quickly, but I guess I question how it will go to have voters sort of select a mayor and then halfway through change our system of government in the middle of a term, and then of course proceed and vote again.
Thank you, Council President. I'm so resisting the temptation to add explanation, but again, I invite council members, for example, if there's interest around that particular question that Council President Bender just raised, feel free to reach out to us and we can talk through our ideas about implementation. We want just for a quick snippet, we were looking at a phased-in implementation, given there will be 3 municipal elections in the span of 5 years. Anything else related to kind of beefing up and augmenting or clarifying policy making, clarifying perhaps council accountability versus mayoral accountability, what may be best practice, the roles and responsibilities between the two, how we can, off of, I believe it was Councilmember Fletcher's comment about how this can really this proposal can really add clarity. And what are there ways that you can think of that could add clarity around all of these items that we've talked about in relation to the questions? Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, and I'm sorry. It's food time in my house, so my dogs might be making noise in the background. So I apologize. I'll try to be quick. I think that one of the challenges that I have with kind of figuring out how to clarify and delineate is like I wonder how much of this is really a charter issue versus like people issue, like a leadership question, because some folks really vibe with the executive position of being, the day-to-day operations, the executive function, like there's clarity around that. When there's an emergency, like one of the things that I really pushed back on was this question of like, when there's emergency, it's totally unclear who was in charge. Like, that to me is not a charter problem, that's a leadership problem. Like when there was an emergency in the city, I had to step into a leadership gap in order to protect and organize and deal with what was happening in my ward, because nobody else was. I have consistently had to, like, there's been multiple children murdered in my ward, and there's been there's been a gap of leadership, and I've had to step into that. So, I really push back on this idea of like, it's unclear. And the reason why that's unclear is because the charter is unclear. We have other instances of emergencies happening in the city, and it's clear who is in charge. Like the mayor is the executive. So I just, I feel that we have right now, we're having this conversation, and like, we have a lot of high level people who have left the city. Yes. And 2020 was an absolute nightmare. Like everywhere in the country, but particularly concentrated here in Minneapolis. So I really want to state, I've worked in the mayor's office before I was elected, and I got to see kind of like, I was there during the 4th precinct occupation. So I just got to see what that looked like. And there was no confusion about who was in charge during that emergency. So I'll just throw that out there for consideration. I wonder how much it's people versus the charter.
Thank you, Councilmember Cunningham. Co-Chair Abbott.
Yeah, I wanted to briefly, let me just say up front, this has been a very productive work group session. I think there's some really, really good ideas that have been kicked around here. And I think one of the questions of logistically how this works is an interesting one. And, the temptation, of course, would be to write language into the amendment or write language into the charter that we would try to solve all these problems in advance. But I think Councilmember Fletcher had a really good point about, kind of what's what goes in an ordinance and what goes in a charter. And, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here on the separation of powers concept. I mean, both the federal and the state government have, administrative procedure acts, for example, that govern how rules and regulations are to be issued and promulgated and whatnot. And to me, the question of how staff is going to work with the council in a separation of powers environment, to me, that's a policy question, which the council itself could address in a policymaking form by passing an ordinance governing, how communications or information is going to be dealt with in the city. I mean, I think what we ought to put in the charter is the principle of separation of powers, and then, of course, how that principle is implemented in terms of policy is, in fact, a council prerogative. And I think that's where some of the specific debates. I think Councilmember Johnson also raised some issues that I think fall into that category as well. I think they're great questions, and I, as a kind of a volunteer commissioner, I don't have the experience working with city staff in the day-to-day responsibility of handling this. So I can't, from a distance, I can't answer those questions. But to me, I don't think that we should be answering those in the charter either. I think that is a policymaking question, and I think that the council ought to address if, in fact, this amendment is put onto the ballot and if in fact is enacted. So. But I just want to say great concepts today. I think this is going to really inform our drafting sessions, and I thank everybody for their contribution.
Thank you, Co-Chair Abbott. Councilmember Reich.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia, and great conversation. A lot to digest. I love the feedback, the back and forth. I also am always encouraged to have an organizational look, particularly at this high level, and I think it's healthy to have this exercise. One comment I want to make, and just because there's so much to cover and respond to, I'll probably be doing some follow-up questions and maybe forwarding some ideas offline. But one thing I just want to make sure we're very clear on and not be loose on is this term of best practice. What does that actually mean, given the exercise that we're endeavoring to partake in? In the world of engineering, there might be a best practice, and it's usually measured by performance. A particular outcome is generated more in one situation than another. Just as an example, an analogy, one could say, oh, a rain garden is a best practice. That really depends on how it's applied, where it's applied, and all of that just gets summed up and measured not by what it is, but what it does. And so if Phoenix, with a strong city manager system, often studied, if that's a best practice, I would want to know based on what outcomes. And of course, what trade-offs, because oftentimes that's held up as an example of an efficient government-like business form. And of course, when you say efficient, it's efficient for whom and efficient for what. And I think that goes to some of the equity issues and representational issues and power disparity within our community issues that a dispersed system at least tries to address, and a more centralized system would definitely challenge without some sort of analysis to what would be a mitigating factor for the levers of power if they're made more efficient. Fewer levers, but who gets to pull? Just general thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Well, and the number of levers are also based on the corresponding leverage that it initiates. Are there any other questions, comments, suggestions? I would like to take this opportunity this does not preclude any more feedback, but I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you to all of you. And for the council members who've been unable to make this, we have reached out to them as they feel the need to share feedback or have any information to share with us. But thank you so much for taking time out of your schedules and juggling everything. And we very, very much appreciate this feedback. We will take a look at it and put it together with the other information we've gathered. I would also like to add, if you do have any follow-ups, feel free to reach out to Co-Chair Abbott and myself, as well as Chair Clegg, or you can also go to Casey, our illustrious city clerk, and he can also get kind of routed over to us, especially if there may be similar questions. I don't see any more hands. Are there any council members that we haven't heard from? Palmisano, Osman. Let's see, who else did I? Let me see, we're on. If not, that's fine. I don't want to, Ellison. I don't mean to necessarily call on anyone either. Just want to make sure that everybody has a chance to share. Yes.
Co-Chair Garcia, this is Lene Palmisano.
Yes.
Thank you for inviting us. I didn't want to, just sit here and be silent, but I have been taking in all of this feedback. And I don't know that I have anything brand new to offer you. I really appreciate the willingness and the initiative to take this on. I have been saying for the entire latter part of this year, right? We acknowledge that there is structural racism in our society, and we need to look at all the different parts of our government, not just our police department, in terms of rooting this out. And at the very least, I think we can all agree that our current system of government was built on, I think, as our city clerk calls it, a chassis from the 1800s, right? And it does not allow us to make decisions sometimes at the speed of modern needs. And I do really applaud some of these ideas, because it will help us try and communicate and figure out what is our form of government? What does it mean? The argument of strong council, weak mayor system, what does that mean? And what can we expect? Other big cities have systems such as what's being proposed. Like you said, you're not really reinventing the wheel. I think we need to explore other models. I think it's very confusing to people, our system. I would go back to trying to figure out the current role and purpose of the Board of Estimate and Taxation and how that fits within our decision-making process. To me, I think that really limits some of the council's authority to act, or as we've learned this past year, for us to be able to modify based on very changing needs and uncertain environments to figure out what's best for our city and to proceed. I'm not, I just think that we should be being transformational here and really thinking about equity. I mean, I have something in my office that's actually written down from a conversation I had years ago with Councilmember Ellison. And it was just the phrase, who benefits, right? With a huge question mark, who benefits from all of the policy work that we do? And I would say we need to take a good hard look at who benefits structurally as we look to revise and evolve our government. One of the really important things that Commissioner Abbott touched on was it would make sense to have a higher level of detail, like how we fairly consider things. What can the public expect, not in the city charter, but in some of the ordinances that actually I was starting to work on pre-COVID with council members Jenkins and Ellison about fair consideration of legislation, and what does that mean? How do we make it knowable to the public as to how decisions will be made around here and what their opportunities are to give feedback, to provide public comments? Some of those things I think would articulate nicely with, as a more detailed version of these larger other structural changes that you're working on. From the conversation here today, I would say it's pretty clear we are not going to fix every problem, right? You cannot, I don't think, in a city charter, find a perfect way to make people get along, right? That should be a basic assumption of city government, that we are all coming from different perspectives, but our goal is all for the good of the city and the public good together, and that we will put that above all things. So I just think this could provide some clarity, and I appreciate that. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all. City Clerk Carl. No.
Madam Chair, I see that Co-Chair Abbott has his hand raised, so.
Yes, Co-Chair Abbott.
We seem to be wrapping up, and I just wanted to say thanks to everybody. I deeply appreciate the time. This has been a very productive meeting. I think it's given us a lot of food for thought and a really good dialogue. I'm very pleased to have been a part of this. So thanks again to everyone, and keep focused. We're definitely going to have some drafting sessions, and if you want to give us some offline feedback or some suggestions on where to add things or delete things, we'll still be paying attention to this for the month of February. So don't be shy. We'll definitely listen to your suggestions if you send them offline. Thanks again, everyone.
Yes, and as you know, we'll also be having a couple of public hearings. So we're definitely open to suggestions for both you, the mayor, and the public. That may not mean that we take them verbatim, but we're definitely open. Thank you. If there isn't anything else to add, we will receive and file these responses. And appreciate your time again, and look forward to hearing from you. And so with this, if there's no objection, I will bring us around to say that we've concluded all business to come before us today, and that we would stand adjourned. Thank you all.